So you'd see a multitude of so-called short passages on the new GRE, on the new shorter GRE, right? While some of them are really short, like the paragraph argument type questions that we solved and practiced, right? Which on average warrant around 1.25 minutes, which is, 1 minute, 15 seconds, for which initially I recommended that you should be making those columns and basically training your brain to see things, see the text, and the broad two classifications of them being factual or them being argumentative in nature, right? But then you have the classic short passages as well. Now, the new GRE sort of uses an umbrella term for passages that can vary from being like legit short to slightly longer, right? So you would have short, like still not as short as paragraph argument, but then slightly longer passages. Now, what do I recommend? I recommend that you give on average 0.7 seconds per word. Of course, you would not be able to calculate it during the test, but I'll tell you um, why this information is useful. And the second thing is, I want you to give roughly 50 seconds to a maximum of 1 minute per question, right? So here's what you're going to do during our assignments, because those have to be timed, right? Here, you're shown a question, you have the timer, and so you have to do everything within those time constraints. But while you're practicing from the assignments that we have attached with this course, you have to time it yourself. So a very good way, what I was preparing for the GRE was, I would just copy the text, right? I would paste it in Word, right? And let's say Word gives me Microsoft Word, by the way, I mean Microsoft Word, or any other software that shows you the word count, right? Let's say it shows that the passage has 250 words. I'll pick up my calculator. 250 times 0.7, okay, that's 175 seconds, divided by 60, okay, so that's like 2.9 seconds. So I'm going to probably spend around 2 minutes 55 seconds to read. So let's just make it 3 minutes for ease. Okay, so let's say I have 3 minutes to read such a passage, and then I would just count the questions. Let's say there were 4 questions. Now 3 minutes and then 50 seconds per question. That's 200 seconds. So yeah, it's like 3.3 minutes. And 3.3 so that's 3.3 minutes. Okay, so 3.3 minutes for questions. So I'll give it a total of 6 minutes. I'll put a timer of 6 minutes and roughly 20 seconds. 6 minutes, 18 to 20 seconds. And I would solve the short passage within these time constraints, right? So just note these timings down, how to time your practice for the normal short passages, or which can be sometimes on the longer end. But the rule is, roughly speaking, going to be the same, roughly 0.7 seconds per word. Just calculate the word count and set up a time limit for reading, and then give a minimum of 50 and a maximum of 1 minute, a maximum of 1 minute per question. So yeah, let's do some practice. The old GRE used to have long passages. And with long passages, I learned that your brain is really well engaged with long tests if you take written notes. If you take written notes, that's really going to help you engage with the text. Now, we do not take this written notes to answer the question. That's not the purpose at all. And if you end up answering any question using your notes, that's going to be a big mistake. So you have to avoid it. The whole point of written notes is to engage your brain with the text, right? But then the question arises, what should I be including in my written notes? Because I cannot be reproducing the whole passage as notes. That's just going to eat up so much time, and that's not a very good time management scheme. Well, here's the answer. So your notes should, from your notes, you should be clearly able to identify what the topic is of the passage. You should be clearly able to identify what the overall purpose of the passage was, right? You should be noting down the different tones, like somewhere in the text, the author might get more assertive, and somewhere in the text, the author might get more suggestive, right? So note those tones down, note the shifts in the tones of the author. And of course, you should be clearly identifying if there's any conclusion of the passage as a whole, right? So notes around these four things are super necessary. Other than that, like for me, timelines were confusing. You know, when the passage was talk about 7 BC and 10 BC, I just get confused. Okay, this is 10. Should this be after? Okay, sorry, it's before Christ. It should be before 7 BC. So I just used to make timelines, you know. And for example, if somewhere in the passage the text is talking about 7 BC, I would write those details or take those notes under the 7 BC column. And then later on, if the passage was talking about something related to 10 BC, I would take notes under the 10 BC column, right? So that just gave me a chronology that, you know, for 10 BC, which comes before 7 BC, that's what the passage says. And, you know, the reason why I'm telling you all of this is because, well, you might have some other weakness, like you might have difficult time um, with geography, with the geographical features of, let's say, a landscape that the passage is talking about, right? So it might be hard for you to track what the passage is saying about north, what the passage is saying about east or west or south, right? So as you progress into practicing passages, and of course, in the beginning, I strictly recommend that you take written notes, like not for very short ones, but passages which are at least a 2 paragraph passage. So take some written notes just to engage with the text better. And you need to practice, extensively practice your ability to identify the topic properly and the purpose. And you should be noticing the different tones, the shift in tones as you read the passage. And of course, you should be clearly able to identify if there's any conclusion in the passage. One of my favorite, most resources for reading is the website alldaily.com. And if you struggle with basic English reading, I strongly recommend that you check out this website. And this website basically has lots and lots of newsletters and articles which are super similar to the type of articles or passages, as the GRE calls it, that you would encounter on the GRE, right? So go do timed, again, the reading has to be timed. Do timed GRE styled reading from aldaily.com and read from the areas of knowledge that you struggle with. Like, for instance, I used to struggle a lot with passages related to law and I'd say art. So it was law and art primarily, right? So once I started reading regularly from, um, from sources that talked about law and art, especially from websites like Al Daily. And back in the days, New York Times, nytimes.com was also very good for to develop GRE style reading. But now I think the text there is not as convoluted as you would find on the GRE. So Al Daily is the best resource. But anyway, you can try New York NY Times as well. So coming to what I was saying, I would read from law and art a lot because these were the areas of knowledge which I struggled with. And although your background knowledge does not help you, but your background knowledge still does two positive things for you. And this is something which test crackers kind of consider a sin saying to students who are preparing for the GRE. So background knowledge does two things. First, it gives you a placebo effect. It gives you a confidence that, okay, I understand this. Okay. Even if you would have been in the same position as you are now, if you had not read a single passage from, let's say, the area of art, you would still feel confident that, okay, you're familiar with it to some extent, right? And that really plays a role in your performance on the GRE as it lowers your stress and that helps you utilize your brain better. And the second thing that background knowledge does for different areas of knowledge is that gets you familiar, it gets you familiar with the expressions for a particular area of knowledge, right? So you do not, and because of that, you avoid reading and rereading, okay? Because again, my problem with passages related to especially art was that I would read them once and I would not be able to make sense of how they're building stuff up. Because again, English is not my first language. And then I was so alien to how they write about art. So I had to reread it and reread it and still end up understanding a fraction of it, right? So to get familiar with the expression of different areas of knowledge, you have to be reading regularly from resources like aldaily.com from the areas of knowledge that you struggle with. We'll come to the solution to this question, but before that, I just want to give you a synopsis of what I just told. So, with passages, you need to be clearly identifying four things. Of course, the topic, the overall purpose, and you should be identifying or noticing the different tones, and of course, you should know if there's any conclusion, or sometimes there can be multiple intermediary conclusions in the passage. So that's, why the slash and the S. And secondly, doing timed, guys, the keyword is timed, okay? You have to time your reading with a rate of 0.7 seconds per word, right? So the practice of timed reading from resources like aldaily.com from weak areas of knowledge will do wonders to you in terms of GRE preparation and strongly recommended. So let's finally come to the question, for which we'll have to read the passage. All right. So in 1955, Maurice Duverger published The Political Role of Women. The first behavioralist multinational comparison of women's electoral participation ever to use election data and survey data together. All right, so it was unique in some way. So it's talking about 1955, some Maurice Duverger. I do not know why I made a column there. Anyway, Maurice Duverger, she wrote about the political role of women. All right, and it was unique in some way. It because it used election data and survey data together. Okay, so use two datas together, and okay, it's a male. Sorry, I'm not very familiar with English names. All right, so his study analyzed women's patterns of voting, political candidacy, and political activism in 4 European countries during the first half of the 20th century. So his study was basically focused on the first half of the 20th century of the, let's say, did it say 20th? Yeah, 20th century. So it's like, yeah, the 1900s, right? So the first half, from there, some 4 countries. And of course, the topic is very self-sufficient and implying what the study must be about. We do not need to go into the nitty-gritties here. Duverger's research findings were that women voted somewhat less frequently than men. Okay, so he found out that women voted less than men. All right. And the difference narrowing the longer women had the vote and were slightly more conservative, and they were more conservative. Okay, interesting times those must have been. Anyway, so Duverger's work set an early standard for the sensitive analysis of women's electoral activities. I like the tone here is, there's a shift in the tone, and it's telling you about the importance of Duverger's work, right? So it became the study became a standard. The study became a standard. His study became a standard. His work became a standard. Moreover, to Duverger's credit, he placed his findings in the context of many of the historical processes that had shaped these activities. Okay, so not only that, there's more to Duverger's credit. So, this passage overall, the tone overall seems pro Duverger. It's praising Duverger. And that's because, he contextualized a lot of things. All right. However, okay, that's a conclusive tone there. However, since these contexts have changed over time, Duverger's approach has proved more durable than his actual findings. Okay, so yeah, that's to say that his findings are obsolete. That's a conclusion. Obsolete findings, though. They were very good for their time and everything, but yeah, they're obsolete now. In addition, Duverger's discussion of his findings was hampered by his failure to consider certain specific factors important to women's electoral participation at the time he collected his data. Okay, so yeah, he had some flaws in his study. And the flaws were that he could not um, consider some factors. Okay, let's read what those factors were. The influence of political regimes, okay, factors like the influence of political regimes, the effects of economic factors, and the ramifications of political and social relations between women and men. Too much details for me to include them in the note, so yeah. But then again, a conclusive tone. Given this failure, Duverger's study foreshadowed the enduring limitations of the behavioralist approach to the multinational study of women's political participation. Okay, so the conclusion is that Duverger's work showed that the behavioralist approach will always have flaws, will always have limitations. That's what foreshadowing means. Okay, so yeah, what do you usually I solve such questions at the end, you know, questions which are asking you the primary purpose of the passage. Why do I solve them at the end? Because, I solve the other ones first, and from solving them, I have to revisit the passage over and over and over again. And, that helps me reread the passage a couple of times from different places, from different, in bits and pieces. And that gives me a better idea of the primary purpose of the passage if I could not extract the primary purpose in my first reading, that is. So that would be my recommendation to you guys as well. Solve such questions at the end, but since this question just appeared in this practice session in the first place, so I'm just going to go about it. All right, so what's the primary purpose of this passage? I mean, it talking about Maurice Duverger, how he did a unique study in 4 European countries, and he found something. So it's all about Duverger studies, and Duverger's work set an early standard, okay, for such an analysis. And moreover, to his credit, he contextualized a lot of his findings, but then he had some flaws in his findings as well. And given those flaws, his study foreshadowed the enduring limitations of the behaviorist approach. So that to me is clearly an evaluation of a research study. But let's read the other options as well. I just saw A and I thought, okay, that's probably correct. Uh, is it summarizing the history of a research area? No, I wouldn't say that, because to summarize the history, the author should have talked about more studies from that era other than Duverger's, so that would have given you a summary of that research area of the area of research pertinent to the political role of women. Okay, is the passage reporting new research findings? I mean, the passage is definitely calling the old ones obsolete. If you go, uh, yeah, so Duverger's approach has proved more durable than his actual findings. Yeah, it's that does mean that the actual findings are obsolete, but then there are no new findings mentioned. So these two go out anyway. Is there any reinterpretation of old research findings? I mean, there is a mention of old research findings. Like, you can say that Duverger's research findings are old, and there's a mention of that, but there's no interpretation, let alone a reinterpretation of what those findings meant. So yeah, option D is clearly not the correct option. And I do not. Is there any reconciling conflicting? No, 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 no. There's no conflicting research findings to begin with, right? There's just findings. There's no remote implication that they are conflicting, right? Let alone a reconciliation of those findings in the passage. So yeah, the passage purpose is clearly to evaluate a research study from different angles. All right, so the question is asking you, or the action item would be to pick an option which answers why Duverger's study in 1955 was unique, right? So, according to the passage, Duverger's study was unique in 1955 in that. Okay, so the first thing that I recommend for the normal short passages, for passages other than paragraph argument type passages, is to read the question and completely ignore the options. Like that should be your first instinct. Just forget about them. Okay? Forget about them. Go to the passage and find answer on your own. So this is something that you just stay with yourself while you're doing short passages, right? So, I mean, what are the keywords? 1955, unique, study. Okay, let's go back. So in 1955, blah, blah, blah. Okay, it says it was the first behaviorist multinational comparison of women's electoral participation ever to use election data and survey data together. Okay, so that is how it was unique, right? It was the first ever to use these two types of data together. So okay, the first option is correct. Um, but yeah, let's just for the sake of it, read through the other options as well. So get was it unique because it gathered data from sources never before used in political studies? I mean, we do not know if election data and survey data was used before or not. I mean, but what we know for sure is that they were not used together before, right? Okay. Was it unique because it included an analysis of historical processes? There's no information in the passage to support that. Again, we have to strictly stick to what the passage is saying, and we basically have to become a proof finder, right? Find the proof for your answer in the passage from the exact lines. If you cannot do that, chances are you are picking the incorrect option. Okay. Um, so, was it unique because it examined the influence on voting behavior of the relationships between women and men? I mean, that happened. I can see something like that mentioned here. I can recall. Okay, where was it? Mm-hmm. Yeah. So there is a mention of the ramifications of political and social relations between women and men, but um, there was a flaw, a shortcoming of Duverger's study, right? It was not Duverger's study was not unique because it did that. It was kind of flawed or kind of lacking because it did not do that, right? So and this option goes out. Okay. Uh, yeah, this option goes out. So, was it unique because it analyzed not only voting and political candidacy, but also other political activities? Um, okay, where's the mention of voting and political candidacy? Okay, patterns of voting, political candidacy, right? But also other political activities. Nah, I mean, the passage is not supporting this option or is not giving any information, which implies that the Verger study was unique because it analyzed not only voting and political candidacy, but also other political activity. But then for option A, we have a clear-cut proof that yeah, it was the first ever to use election data and survey data together. So option A, it was unique because it included both election data and survey data is correct. So, which of the following characteristics of a country is most clearly an example of a factor that Duverger, as described in the passage, failed to consider in his study? So, what did Duverger fail to consider in his study? And if I read, if I hunt for those lines, okay, so this is where it starts. So in addition, Duverger's discussion of his findings were hampered, blah, 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 to consider certain, it was hampered by his failure to consider certain specific factors. And what was those factors? Those factors were the influence of political regimes, the effects of economic factors, the ramifications of political and social relations between women and men. All right. So we have to pick an option which can fall in one of these. Can a large population fall in the influence of political regimes? I don't think so. Can it fall in the effect of economic factors? I mean, how can the failure to consider a large population as a factor be similar to a failure to consider the effects of economic factors? I mean, it could be, but then we'll have to assume stuff. All right. And also, how is the failure to consider a large population is similar to the failure of considering the ramifications of political and social relations between women and men? So now, is the failure to consider a predominantly Protestant population similar to a failure to consider the influence of political regimes? Is that political? That's more religious. Okay. Is it similar to the failure to consider the effects of economic factors? How do you relate that to economic factors? I mean, you can only do that through assumptions. And is it the same as the failure to consider the ramifications of political and social relations between? I mean, it could be, but then again, we'll have to assume that it is, because this being Protestant affects the relations between women and men in XYZ way, and then you'll make up a story and you'll forcefully make it relevant to the factors which Duverger could not consider in his study. All right, a predominantly urban population. Could a failure to consider a predominantly urban population be similar to the failure to consider the influence of political regimes? Nah, I mean, okay, could it be similar to the failure of the effects of economic factors? It could be. We'll have to assume that, because it's urban, I mean, urbanization happens because of certain trends in the economy. I have to make a story, but still, let's put it in a maybe. Okay. Uh, a one-party government could the failure to consider a one-party government be similar to the failure to consider the influence of political regimes? Yeah, what's a regime? A one-party government? Okay, okay, okay. This is definitely the better option than C. Okay, because it fits very nicely into into the failure to consider the influence of political regimes. All right. A location, yeah, location wasn't a factor. Can you, yeah, we cannot fix that and fit that into a failure to consider the influence of political regimes, or a failure to consider the effects of economic factors, or a failure to consider the ramifications of political and social relations between women and men. So I would go with a one-party government, because that that is the best example of a factor that Duverger, as described in the passage, failed to consider in his study, because that fits very nicely into, or that could be super similar, almost identical to the failure to consider the influence of a political regime. If you were to fail at considering a one party government as a factor. So option D is correct. The author implies that Diverger's actual findings are what? Well, with implication type questions, I find it easier to read the options and then to go to the passage and prove or disprove the options from the passage, not from my notes, never ever from my memory, but always from the passage. Okay, so were they limited because they focus only on four countries? I have a mention of four countries here. His study analyzed women's patterns of voting, political candidacy, and political activism in four European countries during the first half of the 20th. Where does it say it was limited because of that? Okay, let's move on. Was it inaccurate in the description of the four countries in the early 90s? Um, hmm, 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 hmm. I mean, it does say these contexts have changed over time, but before that, it just keeps on saying good things about Duverger's study. You know, his study analyzed women's patterns of voting, political candidacy, and political activism in foreground, blah blah blah. And his research findings were, and it was the first ever to use election data and survey data together. So were they inaccurate for 1950s? Nah. Especially since we did say that, however, these contexts have changed over time. Diverge's approach has proved more durable than his actual findings. So yeah, findings are now obsolete. That's an implication that they weren't back then. They were good. Okay, so yeah, this clearly goes out. Are they as are his findings out of date in that they are inapplicable in the four countries today? I think I just read the sentence which says that because it says Duverger's approach has proved more durable than his actual findings. So yep. And what did he study? He conducted the study on the four European countries, right? So yeah, his study uh, his findings are indeed out of date. They're obsolete. The approach isn't, but the findings are. Yeah, there is an implication there. I think this is the correct option. I'm definitely going to rule A out completely. Now, so does it say that his actual findings were flawed because they are based on unsound data? I mean, there is a mention that mm, 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 that he failed to consider specific, but that's not unsound data, that is lacking data. You know, the passage implies that some of the data was ignored, like he did not analyze some factors, but he did not say, the passage does not say that the data that he did analyze was unsound. Okay, this goes out. um, does the passage imply that the verger was biased? I don't, I cannot find a single. Okay, yeah, of course. Comparing C and E, E definitely goes out. There's no mention whatsoever in the whole passage that Duverger's findings were biased because of his political beliefs. So the correct, perfect, best option is option C, that his findings are out of date and that they're inapplicable in the four countries today. So the passage implies that in comparing four European countries, Diverger found that the voting rates of women and men were most different in the country in which women did what? Where would they be the? What are the relevant lines? Diverger's okay, so Diverger's research findings were that women voted somewhat less frequently than men. Okay, so women voted less, and the difference narrowed the longer women had the vote. The difference narrowing the women had the. Okay, so is there an option which says in which women had? Okay, so all right. Uh, if they had the right to vote for a long time, so had to vote for a long time, the difference was narrow. Difference was, or difference would be narrow. You know, women would be voting almost as much as men. All right, so where would it be the most different? Where they were most politically active. I mean, the gap has not been linked with the degree to which men or women were politically active. There's no mention of them running for office and then that in some way affecting the difference between voting rates. I mean, it does say that women were slightly more conservative, but it does not say that if they were more conservative, they voted less or they voted more. So option C cannot be correct. Um, so would the voting rates be the most different if they had the most egalitarian relations with men? Egalitarianism and its effect on voting has not been mentioned anywhere in the passage. Okay. Um, I think it's option E. They had, yeah, it's option E. Had possessed the right to vote for the shortest time. Why? Because, see, it says in these brackets that the difference between their voting rates um, narrowed the longer women had the vote. So, in a country or in a place where women just got the right to vote, the difference would be the most significant. It would be the biggest, right? So, yeah, if they had possessed the right to vote for the shortest time, the voting rates of women and men would be the most different, right? And the difference would narrow as time passes because the more they have the more time they have uh, since the time they got the right to vote, the difference would be narrower. The narrower would be the difference. Okay, so yeah, option E is correct. Okay, the author implies that some behavioralist research involving the multinational study of women's political participation that came after Diverger's study did which of the following. So let me look for lines which talk about, you know, or which touch upon the topic of studies that came after divergers. Mm, There was a word foreshadowing, that is for used for things that come after. So, given this failure, divergers study foreshadowed the enduring limitations of the behavioralist approach to the multinational study of women's political participation. Okay, so the implication is that they would suffer from similar faults, yeah. Did they ignore divergence approach? Where's the approach mentioned? Okay, so there you go. However, since these contexts have changed over time, divergence approach has proved more durable. No option. The passage is implying the exact opposite. It's calling the approach more durable, which is an implication no, that it continued to be used. Only his findings went obsolete, right? So no, they did not. They probably followed Diverger's approach. Did they suffer from falls similar to those in Diverger's study? Well, the last line does tell you that, given this failure, and what failure? His failure to consider certain specific factors, right? And given that failure, Diverger's study foreshadowed the enduring limitations of the behavioralist approach. So yeah, it's a very good option. The passage does in a way imply that his failures basically foreshadowed or prophesized the type of failures that would always be there in the behavioralist approach towards such a research. So it's a very good option. I'm going to put it in a maybe. Um, did the researchers afterward focus on political activism? Well, where's the mention of political activism? Uh, I don't even see the word activism anywhere. I might be wrong, but no. Like, there's no information in the passage. I cannot find any information in the passage saying that, they focus on political activism. Okay. Did they focus on the influences of political regimes? Well, it was a failure of Duverger that he could not consider the influence of political regimes, but then the passage does not tell you that the researchers that followed corrected it or that they focused on it. So yeah, that would be our assumption. Did they focus on the political and social? Yeah, again, this was a flaw of Duverger's. This was a flaw. Where was it? Okay, this was a flaw of Duverger's study. And the passage does not again give you any clue that the ones, in fact, it does the opposite. It says that given this failure, Duverger's study foreshadowed the enduring limitations of the behavioralist approach, right? So basically, the studies that followed had similar fault. They probably even repeated these, right? If I were to extend the implication a little. So yeah, the passage does not imply that they corrected this and they started focusing on the political relations and social relations between women and men. So option B is the best option, is the correct option.